Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is a prince no more. Prince William is in Brazil for the Earthshot prize, and Prince Harry learns to speak like an American. I'm Jack Royston, Newsweek's chief royal correspondent, and this is Newsweek's Royal Report. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the show. It was a hugely dramatic day on Thursday. King Charles III finally took a really strong, clear stance on his brother, Prince Andrew, although Prince Andrew no more. He was stripped of not only his prince title, but the king also stripped Andrew of his Duke of York title. He's been, kicked out of all kinds of other things like the Order of the Garter, but he is going still to lose his Vice Admiral rank with the Royal Navy, which was an honorary rank. While he did serve in the forces, Andrew never rose to the rank of Vice Admiral. He got it to mark, I think it was his 55th birthday. So that's going too. Obviously, all of this relates to Prince Andrew's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the allegations against him. So Virginia Giuffre said that in 2001, she was trafficked to London, New York, and the US Virgin Islands and forced to have sex with Prince Andrew by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. She presented as evidence to back up her accounts a photo of Andrew with his arm around her waist, taken by Epstein, she says, at Ghislaine Maxwell's London townhouse. Now, Virginia sued Andrew in court in New York. He had an opportunity to potentially try to clear his name. He turned it down, instead settling out of court, while not admitting liability, but for a very large sum of money that has never been actually officially disclosed. Now, Andrew has always denied the allegations against him, and continues to do so. But this scandal was building and building and building because a whole load of new material was being released into the public domain, including emails between Andrew and Epstein that had undermined Andrew's account of, in particular, a visit to New York where he stayed at Jeffrey Epstein's house. He stayed at Jeffrey Epstein's mansion in New York, where some of the abuse took place. And he said he did that in December 2010 in order to cut off his friendship with Epstein in person, because that was the honourable thing to do, and he was too honourable. And then it emerged that in February 2011, he sent Epstein an email immediately after Virginia Giuffre's first newspaper interview was published, saying, I'm more worried about how this is affecting you. We'll just have to rise above it and we'll play again soon. So amidst all of this kind of mounting pressure, not just on Andrew, but on the monarchy to actually take a strong stance, the king has obviously made this decision that past efforts to tackle the Andrew crisis had not been enough. So I'm going to read what the actual Buckingham Palace statement said in just a second. But first of all, I actually want to start with the statement that came from Virginia's family. So Virginia's brother, Sky Roberts, told the BBC, "This normal girl from a normal family has taken down a prince. We are so proud of her." And Virginia's sister-in-law, Amanda Roberts, said, "It is truly a moment for her and all survivors. Everything she fought for was not in vain." And actually, Sky Roberts' interview with the BBC was very moving. He said all of this through tears, basically. He was clearly, visibly very moved by the kind of victory. I mean, they really are celebrating this as a victory for Virginia. Now, Virginia obviously passed away in April in 2025. From what her family have described as a suicide and what her publisher describes as a suicide. And obviously, not only did this decision come off the back of various emails that Andrew sent come to light, but it also came off the back of Virginia's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, being published months after her death. So it is, it's a huge victory for Virginia. And if she was alive to see it, I think she would have been hugely encouraged, and, she would have felt optimistic on the back of this win. Now, she had other problems in her life going on and other family issues, and those wouldn't have gone away just because this had happened. But I think she would have had a huge boost from this win. But let's also talk about the actual palace statement. So it was released on October the 30th at about 7 p.m. UK time. It was one of those situations where, we were told to expect a statement coming, so we knew in advance. And we knew, obviously, it was going to be Andrew related. We didn't know exactly what it was going to say. I expected it to be about Royal Lodge, Andrew's 30-room mansion in Windsor, which he has been forced to leave. So Royal Lodge was in there. Honestly, I did not in a million years expect them to take away his prince title and return him to being a kind of a commoner, so to speak, to use the not particularly sensitive language of kind of aristocratic Britain, but that is the word for it. But here's what the statement says. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honours of Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. His lease on Royal Lodge has to date provided him with legal protection to continue in residence. A formal notice has now been served to surrender the lease, and he will move to alternative private accommodation. These censures are deemed necessary, notwithstanding the facts that he continues to deny the allegations against him. And this is a crucial bit, which has been missing from all of Andrew's past statements. The Buckingham Palace statement ends with, "Their Majesties," note the plural, "wish to make clear that their thoughts and utmost sympathies have been and will remain with the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse." And I say note the plural in that because obviously Queen Camilla works to support rape charities. And so I'm sure she will have found this whole process extremely difficult watching. And, bear in mind, well, it must have been, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3, that Andrew was allowed to release his own statement in his own words, in which he said he was giving up the use of his titles. So he kept the titles initially, but he was giving up the use of the titles to avoid being a distraction to the good work of the monarchy. And he didn't say anything about sympathy for the victims. He said he was doing his duty as he has always done. So this statement has got it much better, but it is also actually the first time. It's the first time that the monarchy has actually issued its own statement on Prince Andrew. Before, he's always been left to speak for himself. No matter how bad the crisis was, they always just basically did the equivalent, the PR equivalent of kind of handing the microphone to Andrew. And I think the feeling was inside the palace that they were making him take responsibility by speaking for himself. But obviously that always enabled him to kind of duck and dodge and swerve and try to just kind of, not be held to account, essentially. So what this has done for the very, very first time, and bear in mind, this scandal first emerged kind of December 2010 into February 2011. And in all that time, close to 15 years, this is the first time that a monarch has gone on the record via a Buckingham Palace statement to express the monarchy's perspective on Andrew. Right? It should not in a million years have taken them 15 years to do it, but it is a good thing that it's now happened. And I think I'll talk about polling a little bit more later on, but I think there are signs that British public opinion supports Charles's decision, but does think that it came too slowly, essentially, is the top line. But what else can we read into this statement? So the reference to survivors and victims is so important, because obviously when Andrew gave his car crash interview to Emily Mayfirst, that was one of the big take homes from it, is that he didn't express any sympathy for Epstein's victims. And even if he wants to maintain his own innocence and say that the allegations against him are false, there is absolutely no reason at all not to express sympathy for Epstein's victims. And it was this really kind of bizarre thing to not do that. Like a day one press officer would tell you, express sympathies for the victims of sex trafficking and child abuse. Like, it's crazy not to. So they made sure to get that in there. And then, of course, the big question is what happens next. Now, does the scandal go away? Should it go away is the other question. And I mean, in terms of news organizations writing about Andrew in relation to Epstein, no, I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. They will continue to write about it. And, my understanding is there are investigative journalists who have been working on this for months, dating back to before this new round of reporting, who I'm sure will still continue working on it. And there are signs of some of the fruits of some of their labor starting to appear in dribs and drabs in the British media. So I'm sure that will continue. And there are whole sections of this to be unpacked. So some of these emails that have been coming out about Andrew, and actually there's a new one, let me say, before I go deep into that. There's already been, since this statement on Thursday, there's already been a new email to emerge, which was one that Andrew sent to Jeffrey Epstein in the kind of run up just before he traveled to New York to supposedly break off the friendship for being too honorable in December 2010. So in April 2010, so about, what would that be, 8 months out from going to stay with Epstein in New York, Andrew emailed Epstein. At a point, he said to Emily Maitlis, let's recap the timeline. In 2019, in his BBC Newsnight interview, he said 2006 was when he cut off ties with Jeffrey Epstein. And then 2010 was the last time he saw him, flying out to New York to stay with him in order to formally, officially end the friendship, because that was the honorable thing to do. But contact stopped in 2006. So we now have April 2010. Andrew emails Epstein. And it basically along the lines, they're trying to come up with a date to maybe see each other. And Andrew's saying, that it would be good to catch up in person. Now, obviously, if he's going to stay with Epstein in New York, some communication must have happened in order to organize that. So the basic surface level of the email doesn't necessarily contradict Andrew's account, because obviously you wouldn't necessarily, if we assume that Andrew was telling the truth, and there are innumerable reasons not to assume that, but if we assume for argument's sake that he was, you wouldn't necessarily say in your initial email, oh, well, I'm coming to break off the friendship in person, because that would break off the friendship. No one's going to take that visit. So on the surface level, it doesn't, except that they're not just talking about this New York visit. So Andrew is also talking, Epstein's clearly trying to broker a meeting of some kind between Andrew and a guy called Jess Staley, a big shot banker. And so that's the element that contradicts what Andrew said to Emily Maitlis, which is that this is not simply contact in service of producing that meeting in New York. It's also in service of some other thing that's clearly going on behind the scenes involving Jess Staley. And that is another whole area of this that hasn't been properly unpacked yet. Like, what was going on there? Why did Epstein want to introduce Andrew to Jess Staley? What was the nature of the relationship between Staley and Epstein? Obviously, Staley might well say it was, he had absolutely no, I'm sure he would probably say he had absolutely no idea about Epstein's crimes, and it was all completely benign. But there is a huge potential for there to be more stories unpacking what was really going on there. It's another reason to think that we haven't heard the end of this, and that there will be more stories to emerge, because this is a whole aspect of it that we know very little about in reality. What was it that Andrew was hoping to get from meeting Jess Staley? Was it anything to do with Sarah Ferguson's gargantuan debts that she was trying to resolve at this time? And that we know Epstein helped Sarah Ferguson resolve those debts, but right now all we know is that Epstein lent her about 15 grand. So if it turns out that actually he brokered some much bigger deal, then obviously that would be a massive story. So I don't, in short, think that this is going away. The reporting of this is not going to stop, and nor actually should it stop. It's not the right thing for reporting to stop just because it has the potential to cause reputational damage for the monarchy. The pernicious, horrific, traumatic impact of sex trafficking and sexual abuse is too important to try to say that we all have to stop talking about it now because it might be bad for the monarchy. You cannot put institutional reputations above the public interest in exposing and trying to stop future examples of sex trafficking and child abuse, because that's really what it's about. If we take a strong stance on these issues, our hope is that it will encourage people to stop this stuff from happening again in the future. It's a never again issue. I honestly am not particularly hoping even that the stories will stop coming out. But the question is, has the monarchy taken a strong enough stance on this issue now that people can view the institution of the palace to be on the right side of this question, not the wrong side? Because the perception up until now, among huge swathes of the British public, is being that the palace were actively shielding Andrew, that they were protecting him. And I still get people coming on to me, even now, even in the last few days, I've had people saying, when will the palace hand over Andrew to the police? Which, they're not actually actively stopping the police in that way from getting to Andrew. The police have reviewed this issue a whole load of times. And unfortunately, I've always taken the view that they weren't going to prosecute Virginia's allegations. And So in that sense, the palace, there's no question the palace handing Andrew over, because that's not how it works. The police would have to would have to issue a summons to try and bring Andrew in for an interview under caution, would be the process. But there is the possibility that that could still happen. It's not going to happen, I don't think, in relation to Virginia's allegations, because she would be needed as a witness in court. It would so much would hinge on her reliability as a witness. So I just cannot see her core allegations being tried without her presence in court to be tested as a witness. And now that she's passed away, that's not going to be possible. But this issue of Andrew, February 2011, we've had an email leak now in which he sent an email to a deputy press secretary to the Queen, saying that he had asked a police protection officer to basically effectively dig up dirt on Virginia. And he said, I've handed over her social security number and date of birth. I've heard she's had a criminal record, and asked the on-duty PPO to look into it. And that is potentially a offence of misconduct in a public office. So we'll have to see. The police have said they're actively looking into that. And so we'll have to see whether they take that or not, whether they launch a full-scale investigation, whether they bring Andrew in, whether he's interviewed or not, what he says when he is, whether the palace hand over Andrew's emails to the police. And that is another big question here. If it gets to the point of the palace needing to do more, I mean, the other way that a major corporation might deal with this is if you look at the way that the Murdoch press, that Rupert Murdoch's media empire, responded to phone hacking allegations back in 2009, 2010, 2011. They brought in outside legal counsel, an outside law firm, to review I think millions of emails, and to determine which ones needed to be handed over to the police as part of a Metropolitan Police investigation into phone hacking and other allegations. So that's another thing they could do, is they could actually launch a review of Andrew's emails through his official palace email account, email address, and the other emails sent between press officers, and find out what those emails say. And they could get them reviewed by an outside law firm that has no particular obligation to anybody, and for that law firm to then determine whether any need to be handed over to the police, and to make that happen if deemed necessary. So that is another option they could go down. But another aspect of this is Andrew. So another aspect of this is, like I said, Andrew's been told to leave Royal Lodge. So the question is, where's he going next? Well, the answer we already have, which is that he's going to move to a home in Sandringham Estate. So not necessarily the kind of what's known as the big house, the main house in Sandringham, but it will be one of the other houses there. So that is really interesting. So getting Andrew out of Royal Lodge was really important. A huge amount of pressure was building around it, not least of all because Andrew hasn't really properly paid rent in years at Royal Lodge. He kind of paid forwards. He paid £1 million up front. He funded £7.5 million of renovations at Royal Lodge, and then this was all way back in the 2000s. And since then, he's paid what's known as a peppercorn rent, which is basically no rent. It means you just have to pay like a little something, i.e. a peppercorn is the example. So he's effectively paid no rent in decades. And with every year that passes and he stays there, the value for money that he gets out of that deal only gets better and better and better with time. And it was a 75-year lease. So getting him out of Royal Lodge was really important, but taking him in at Sandringham, and we also understand the King's kind of helping him out a bit financially, does mean that there isn't total separation. And the King, it risks the continued perception that actually the King is shielding Andrew. Actually, when Virginia was trying to file her civil lawsuit against Andrew, her lawyers needed to serve Andrew papers, and they had to do this in person. And so one problem they had is they literally couldn't physically get to him. They couldn't get anywhere near him because he was staying in these royal residences. Including he went to stay up Balmoral with the Queen. And so that created a real, perfect symbolism for the kind of monarchy's reputational crisis, which is that they appeared to be literally shielding Andrew from the process of being served papers by a woman who wanted to accuse him of rape in that case. Obviously, like I said, he denies it, but and Charles, again, the Sandringham Estate is private property. You can't just walk onto it and go for a stroll around the grounds. So Andrew being in a house on the Sandringham estate means he's not on royal as in monarchy terrain, because Sandringham is privately owned. It's not, the estate at Windsor Castle is owned by us, by the British public, and also so is Royal Lodge. Royal Lodge is owned by a property portfolio called the Crown Estate. Whoever is the reigning monarch of the day, their name is on the paperwork, but if they don't own it individually as a person, Charles as a person does not own the Crown Estate, and in fact, various systems have been put in place to make it independent of the monarchy. So actually, all the profits from the Crown Estate go to the Treasury. They go to Downing Street. They go to the government, and then a percentage of those profits is given back to the monarchy as its public funding. So Crown Estate owned Royal Lodge. Andrew leased it from them, but he was on public, like a publicly owned asset was his house. So Sandringham is not publicly owned. It's not part of the Crown Estate. Charles owns it individually as a private person, but because he's living effectively in Charles's house, whichever property they choose, Charles hasn't completely distanced himself from Andrew, and we understand that he's going to be giving Andrew a little bit of money. So, it's a really difficult one, because if Charles didn't give Andrew any money and did just kick him out onto the street, it's equally possible that he could wind up in the hands of a kind of foreign intelligence asset. He could wind up being an asset for an intelligence agency overseas. He had this friendship, and one of his other scandals was a friendship with a man called Yang Tengbo, who's British intelligence considered to be a Chinese spy. They kicked him out of Britain. Now, Yang Tengbo denies that and appealed and lost his appeal. But he had a friendship with Andrew that really did smack of that kind of spy relationship, where he was kind of getting Andrew to kind of do small break of the rule kind of situations, smuggling him into Royal Lodge without his name being recorded in official, in the official guest list or whatever, and going behind the backs of ex-private secretaries. So he was doing that classic thing that spies do, where they introduce small rule breaking into the relationship. So, we don't want that situation. We don't want Andrew saying, oh, well, forget you, forget Britain. I'll go and I'll just sell myself to a foreign intelligence, agency, and I'll give them all the royal family secrets, which they can then, use to try to exert influence. And I'll help make introductions to other people in aristocratic British society. And we don't want him working for another government. So it is a really tricky one. And having him a bit in-house does make some sense. But it does create this residual reputational risk for the monarchy and for Charles, that people still think Charles is protecting him and shielding him from allegations. Because like I said, there is still this perception that he needs to be handed over to the police, when in reality, as of now, the police have not actually asked for that to happen. So, look, Charles, clearly, it's so much better than where the monarchy was before. And, we are told by palace insiders, we in the media have been told, myself included, that, Charles has done this because he does think that there were significant kind of errors of judgment or judgment failings by Andrew, in notwithstanding the fact that Andrew denies the central allegations against him. And that is so much better than what the messaging has been up until this point, with Andrew saying like he always did his duty and he just wanted to stop being a distraction. That was ridiculous. So it's a much stronger stance, and it makes so much sense to do that, because really, the question underneath it all is, how should the monarchy is supposed to show leadership, and Charles is supposed to show leadership. So the underlying question was always, how should we as a society respond to allegations of child abuse, of rape, of sex trafficking? How should we as a society? And if you were to pit people off the street, I don't think anyone would say, oh, well, probably you should just kind of deny it all, hope it goes away, sweep it under the carpet a little bit. From 2011, when some of this stuff first started coming out, through a whole load of civil lawsuits in America in kind of 2016, in which the allegations against Andrew came out in the British press. It was then 2019 before Andrew tried to clear his name on television. That went obviously terribly. He was told to step back from public duties, but then didn't cooperate with the FBI for a period of time while they were trying to get his witness testimony. So, there have been so many moments in this whole process where Andrew was not behaving in a way that we expect from public figures. And it's taken way, way, way too long, but they did get there in the end. So I talked earlier about the polling. The polling says 80% of people think that Charles made the right decision. So I think it was actually 79. So obviously, overwhelmingly people think it was the right thing to strip Andrew of his titles, but around about just a little shy of 60%, I think about 58% said Charles was too slow. No, I think 3% thought he did it too quickly. I don't know what's going on with those 3%, but they have their opinions. About 20% felt it was the right time, but not too slow. But those numbers are stark, and they do show the king. They will reassure the king that what he's done is the right thing, that what he's done was necessary and it had to happen. But they do make it very clear that people think this was a long time coming, which of course it was. And the other key difference here is that Paris need to continue moving away from this framing and perception that what this is about is preventing reputational damage to the monarchy. It cannot be about that. Because putting the reputation of an institution first is what has led to a whole load of these kind of scandals and crises, never being dealt with, from Harvey Weinstein to, the BBC, because there was a massive scandal around a guy called Jimmy Savile, who was probably Britain's most notorious paedophile and sexual abuser. And, again, there were, the BBC's reputation was put before stopping him from being a predator. So you absolutely cannot have framing where an institution's reputation is being put first. But we'll see how things progress. I think the big test is going to be, does Andrew ever get seen in public with the royals ever again? And they should be aiming for basically no, like maybe at a funeral, but even then it's very difficult. I mean, he just, it's really, really difficult to tell someone they can't go to a funeral, especially a funeral for their own father, which, I'm not saying is coming anytime soon, but it's going to come at some point. And so, would Andrew be invited to Charles's funeral, whenever it may be, hopefully many years away? You probably would have to invite him, but then, Andrew needs to get it into his head that he can't be going up to other members of the royal family and chatting to them and laughing with them and, looking friendly and pally with them. He needs to understand his own radioactivity. But in the much more immediate term, we're not expecting him at Christmas this year. Will he be at Easter? Will he turn up at church in Windsor at Easter? And is the ban on Christmas going to be permanent? Because it's kind of vague. The noises coming out of palace sources at the moment are kind of vague along lines. Well, he understands that he can't come to Christmases, but what really, is he going to stick to that? Does that mean he will never be seen in public with the royals again? That is the key thing, because if he finds any little loophole or workaround or moment when he can thrust himself back into the limelight, and Charles is photographed or filmed laughing with him and chatting with him, then you're virtually back to square one. So, huge progress on this, and I hope that this marks the start of a new era for the monarchy. Because the other legacy issue, there are two issues going forward for this. One, this is huge for the royals because it potentially sets a precedent. This is the first time since the abdication crisis in 1936, when Edward VIII gave up the throne in order to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, and he was basically forced to give up the throne by the British government. It's the first time since then that a royal family member has had to step down because they did something that was deemed to be morally wrong. Or has been kicked out, rather, given the heave-ho. He obviously stepped down voluntarily initially, and now he's been actively told in no uncertain terms that he's not wanted anymore. So that is one thing. This creates a potential precedent. What happens if there's another royal family member in the future? Will people start demanding Harry and Meghan be stripped of their titles? I think probably Harry and Meghan will be all right unless they start to really upset people again and kind of declare war on the monarchy again. If they do, then absolutely yes, people will start demanding that. If they play a clean game, so to speak, then I think they'll probably be all right. But then the other issue is, has the monarchy actually turned a corner in terms of knowing how to deal with situations where a royal family member's actions have become, either beyond the pale or need to be changed or reined in some way. Like if this happens again in another circumstance that no doubt will be different in some ways, will the palace know what to do? Will they handle it better? So I go back to the allegations against bullying against Meghan, which, maybe you believe them, maybe you don't, maybe you love Meghan, maybe you hate her, but whatever you think about it, the Kensington Palace press secretary Jason Knuff went on record to accuse Meghan of bullying staff out of the private office, because he wanted to draw attention to this fact, to this problem, that there isn't a system within the monarchy for how you rein in a royal family member who you consider to be misbehaving. There's no system for it. They're not staff members. You can't subject them to disciplinary proceedings. You can't. There's not really anything you can do. Like, you can't fire them. What they should do, what a football club would do, like a soccer club, is they would say, in a situation like this, because these things have come up. Soccer clubs have been put in the situation where they've had to say, you are not just a footballer, you're not just an athlete, you are an inspiration to kids, people idolize you, and you're expected to conduct yourself up to a certain moral standard. And if you fail to meet those standards, even if it's off the pitch, then we'll give you the door, we'll show you the door. And so the monarchy needs to make expectations clear to the royals themselves. The royals need to understand that there are expectations placed upon them. And if they don't live up to those expectations, then there will be repercussions and there will be accountability. And it's that foreknowledge that your behavior is not going to be tolerated that reins people in before they've actually done the bad thing, before the crisis has ever happened. So that's what the monarchy needs to focus on next. It needs to focus on the never again aspects to this. Prince William is in Brazil at the point I'm recording this anyway, and that gives him a real challenge because he's got his biggest event, the Earthshot Prize, of his whole year. I mean, it's one of his legacy projects that he's going to hope to look back on in 20 years' time and see as a big part of the good work that he did as a royal family member, and this is going to be obviously significantly overshadowed by Prince Andrew and that scandal. But that doesn't mean there's no chance of Prince William getting into the papers. I think he will get some stories in there, but he's just going to have to work so much harder. And so it comes back to that issue that all of the stuff that the royals want people to care about becomes so much harder for ordinary people to care about when the Andrew issue is not properly dealt with. But essentially, William's got a strong start to this particular tour, so he's going to touch down in Brazil. And then he's got this summit for a organization called United for Wildlife. By the time you're listening or watching, it may well already have happened, almost certainly. And he's got a big announcement, which is a new partnership, which is designed. It's really interesting, actually. It's about nature protectors. And so when I tell you a little bit about this, you might well be reminded of another royal scandal involving one of Prince Harry's organizations, which is African Parks, because they got into, they brought in outside investigators and had to admit that they had, their rangers had been mistreating indigenous people in the Congo. And so there was a really kind of toxic cloud over African Parks, really serious allegations, the rape and torture and abuse of indigenous tribal people who were trying basically they were hunter-gatherers who were trying to go into this rainforest that African Parks was employed to protect. And they were going in kind of gathering food in the way that their tribe has done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the rangers for this organization were mistreating them as a result. Now, William also works in conservation in Africa, and they say he's come up with this project that is taking a very different tone on indigenous peoples. And so they have this partnership which is supposed to protect both the people who try to stop poachers, i.e. rangers. So it talks, about the success of, the work they're doing with rangers in South Africa, but also and a commitment to those risking their lives to protect nature, because some of the rangers that William works with have actually been killed in the line of duty. But also there's this real emphasis on indigenous peoples and protecting them. So here's what Prince William had to say about it. is saying in his speech. Indigenous peoples and local communities have long been protectors of the world's most critical ecosystems, but today their lives are increasingly at risk and their lands are under mounting threats. If we are serious about tackling the climate crisis and restoring nature, we must stand with those who defend it. Building on the success of our Ranger Support Package, we're extending this with a new partnership to protect and assist Brazil's frontline defenders. So this is at least it reads to me as much more in keeping with the perspective on indigenous tribes held by an organization called Survival International. Now, Survival are the ones who have been pushing this scandal about African parks. And what they say is that actually indigenous peoples are the best protectors of the rainforest because they have been the guardians of the rainforest for hundreds and hundreds of years, for centuries. And that actually, if you leave it to them and you trust them, then they will not exploit and deplete their own natural resources that they depend on to live. And that they will be sustainable and responsible in the way that they use those resources. So this William's statement, his speech that he's given, has much more of the kind of tone of the Survival International attitude. I don't yet know what Survival would think of William's project. They might be in favor, they might not be, but at the very least, the messaging is much more in keeping. But obviously, this is where he begins. William starts his tour of Brazil with Unite for Wildlife, with that summit in Rio de Janeiro, which is going to be a big moment for him. But then the main event, obviously, will be the Earthshot Prize ceremony, and that is November the 5th. Which is kind of interesting because actually anyone brought up in Britain will know to remember the 5th of November for a very different reason, which is it's Guy Fawkes Night. But no doubt that was just a complete coincidence. But do check it out. Check out the Earthshot Prize. It's a good initiative. It's one thing with William is that he aims very, very high with his projects, and sometimes I think he sets the bar higher than it's going to be possible for him to achieve. But Earthshot Prize is very good at giving funding to initiatives that aim to address the climate crisis. So it's £1 million, £1 million of funding for each of 5 causes in 5 different categories every year for 10 years from 2020 through to 2030. So he's round about halfway through now. So he got really into the meat of the project, and has already dished out half the money by the time this year wraps up. But no, it doesn't feel like he's going to alight on one single issue that transforms planet Earth and single-handedly kind of saves us from the climate crisis. It's more about chipping away at it bit by bit. So I think in terms of the wider framing given to Earthshot, there is a small risk that people's expectations are too high in terms of what it's possible to deliver. Needless to say, though, it is a good cause, and they are backing good solutions to a really, really important project, a really important problem, and I think that's what William will hold on to. Prince Harry is another man struggling to get the attention for his own work in the midst of the Prince Andrew catastrophe. But he has gone on a podcast with a comedian, Hassan Minhaj, and the show is called Hassan Minhaj Doesn't Know. It was a fairly light-hearted interview in many places, but it actually had a serious message underneath it. So there's this quite funny bit where Hassan is trying to teach Harry how to talk like an American, and really going into like the pronunciation of different words, trying to get him to kind of order ranch sauce from Applebee's, I think it is. So it's quite funny to watch if you go online and check it out. But also there's a whole discussion. Actually, there's a little bit about Harry's book. He actually jokes. This is what's quite interesting. He kind of does take the mick out of Harry a little bit, which Harry doesn't get a huge amount of the time. But he talks about the bit in Harry's book Spare where he says that King Charles gave him an allowance, a clothing allowance, but only for formal wear. And so outside of that, he would shop at TK Maxx, the value store. And so Hassan Minhaj is kind of saying like, "Oh, I feel for you," kind of making, I got a tiny violin playing just for you kind of vibe. So that's quite funny, but there is a serious message underneath it all, which is about the kind of ills of social media and digital technology and the impact on children and teenagers. And so, I would say go out and watch it, if only for that. So Harry said, social media is taking young men and young boys into very dark places, which should concern all of us. So Harry's been talking, and Meghan actually both have been talking about this issue, the impact of social media and digital technology on young people for a long time now. I think it is a really important cause. I think it's one where actually parents do agree with them. I think what they probably need to work on is trying to kind of find a way to have more impact, which is tough. Like, it is really hard. And especially because we're going through a period now where people are kind of stopped wanting celebrities to be the kind of heroes of social political movements. So it's not easy for them. But this is definitely an issue with legs. You know, you're still going to be talking about this in 10 years' time, and it's going to have a whole new dimension coming in with AI chatbots suddenly becoming a talking point. So I think if they keep plugging away at it and maybe try some different approaches, they may alight on a way of tackling this issue that gets proper attention to a really important cause. And the other interesting thing that Harry came out, he was asked again whether he'd apply for US citizenship, and he said that he's not necessarily against the idea, but there are no current plans to do it, which is the same response he gave. When would it have been now? Probably a good couple of years ago, I think. And so that is interesting in and of itself, that he doesn't seem to have moved his stance. So it does seem like for now he's not planning on doing it. And the part of the reason why it would be controversial if he did is because he would actually have to give an oath to renounce his allegiance to any foreign prince. So you basically have to formally cast off any allegiance to the royal family, which would obviously set the cat among the pigeons. And that's it for this episode of The Royal Report. Be sure to join me every week when I visit the latest royal headlines, embark on some royal deep dives, and riff on all things royal. Until next time, goodbye, and a curtsy to you all.